Okay, so let's get started on volume 2 here, which is global illumination interiors. And what we're going to be doing in this one is talk about some, obviously, how we apply what we've learned and what are the difference between exterior and interior. So in order to do that, what I want to talk about in this first chapter is just to do a small revision of what is important in the first DVD and how those concepts apply back to what's important in this next DVD coming up. So did a couple of images just to help things out a little bit, and just talked about the whole concept of reflection again, and just get a recap on that, so we got a good solid knowledge of what that is. So as you remember, we talked about the fact that everything is basically a reflection, and here what we've got an image that's illustrating is this little bear thing that I've created, and what I'm trying to illustrate on this is basically just specular reflection, which is, as we all already knew from the first one, reflection. And specular reflection, there's no diffuse on this whatsoever. It's black, as you can notice, and I do have a Fresnel fall off on it as well, so it's following all those properties that we talked about that are important, etc. And this is just a straight reflection, and there's nothing about it that's special beyond that. And then what we've done now is we're going to look at what happens if we actually go into here and we apply a slight scattering of those specular rays, which of course gives us the roughness that we were looking for. And this is, we talked about the slight roughness effect and how that affects our look. And of course, we do it a little bit more, or a lot more. And this sort of starts to go into the diffuse category, and we mentioned that aspect of it. Of course, now if we talk about diffuse is actually calculated very differently. We talked about different methods of doing that, and this is showing us diffuse reflection. This scene, of course, that I'm looking at does have an HDR in it and does have a light source, which is a soft light source, area light. And this is our diffuse reflection, and we see the capturing in this area of the yellow and of the HDR and different strengths, and all of the stuff that we've talked about in the previous DVD, and the fact that it's bouncing around inside there, and we're getting some color bleeding just slightly in this area, etc. So keep going. What we talk about now is the fact that we can actually add specular and diffuse together, and this is how we get these types of looks. And of course, we may not necessarily want a completely shiny, very glossy reflection, so we add some roughness to it or decrease the glossiness in it, and it creates that aspect. And of course, we do it one more time, and it creates that. And we've also learned that basically, when we were doing our concrete model, that specular reflections in a very, very rough state is just as important as it is in the other, as not having it. And we saw that in those concrete embankments and how those are important to us in terms of getting that. And that, of course, will remain true in this one as well, especially in the fact that interior light sources will have a lot of light, and those things are going to be important. So if you actually look at the comparison, we'll see that just diffuse only, and then as we start bringing the specular down, or the roughness up, or glossiness down, starts to get the rougher look. But this look is going to be more important to what we want to try to achieve on certain materials than just diffuse alone. Okay, so beyond that, we have a few other points we pointed out. And that was the idea of different global illumination techniques. And we will start to hit on a few more of those in this particular volume, because interiors is a little more intricate in terms of how it deals with global illumination. One technique that we mentioned was the radiosity technique that we saw straight out of 3D Studio Max, which is brought on in the same way that they did on Lightscape. And we talked about the adaptive meshing and some of the other techniques that are done. This method is actually very good still for interiors, but it still has all the problems of heavy geometry and heavy memory. So we're not going to focus on it. We're going to still focus on Vray and on ray tracing techniques. One such ray tracing technique that we only touched on but we did not cover was photon mapping, and we'll probably be covering that more on this chapter. And what we mentioned about photon mapping is a few things. One is that it's very, very fast, and it still is very fast, and it can bounce light around quite a bit, and that's also good. The main reason it was a downfall in exterior scenes is because we only really have one big light source, like the sun, for example, in an exterior scene. And there's sometimes other light sources, but generally not as important. And that the quality can just not follow up on it. But if you have lots of little light sources, photon mapping might start to become interesting again, and we're going to start looking at those techniques and see how photon mapping can really start to affect our scene. And if you remember what photon mapping, what main points we made about that is photon mapping is actually samples of light or samples of light that are photons that are shot out from a light source and bounce around until we tell them to stop bouncing. And those that type of exercise is then gathered and then averaged out depending on different settings to create the global illumination in our scene. But that type of lighting is going to start become more important, and we'll start looking at some techniques as well as some other techniques. So photon mapping is not the only one either. Then, of course, we talked about the quasi-Monte Carlo system, and this is still going to be very, very important. And for those of you that have not covered this in the first one, I would definitely encourage you guys to go back and look at this again, because it's going to be basically how we do all of our finessing and our high quality in our GI. So quasi-Monte Carlo system, that's just a brute force one, is done by shooting rays from the samples, and we talked about that. And the big key thing to remember about that is that low samples means low rendering times, high samples mean high rendering times, and it's almost exponential because it just works right in conjunction with each other. There's some optimization techniques that take place that are good. Vray is very intelligent about trying to be adaptive, but when you're just doing these quasi-Monte Carlo, you're not getting as much of that optimization as you would in other techniques, such as using this irradiance map stuff. So irradiance maps are important as well, and we talked about that. And basically, they're more adaptive in the fact that they collect samples, or more samples which are needed in these areas here. And sort of this illustrates one of the sample maps we had. This is actually a medium one, and this is a high one. But I think you'll get the point. If you've done the chapters, you'll remember exactly what these are about. But the idea of creating these tight samples are still going to be a very valid point. The big key thing that it served us for exterior scenes was when we were doing them for skylights. They were very important in that technique, but they're still very, very important in creating all the finesse that we need in our interior scenes as well. So we need to make sure we remember about the irradiance map settings as well. Then the next thing we covered was talking about skylights. And skylights were obviously one of the big key things in exterior scenes, but they're still very valid when we're talking about interior scenes. And the reason being that we're going to be looking at literally the skylight, where there's openings or windows in our interiors, and how does exterior light or ambient light from the exterior come in. And we'll talk about some of those interesting concepts as well. So this particular image here shows us just a straight skylight with an even color all around in the sky. And that was, a technique we followed. And we also talked about how we had to bounce light around to get it inside there. Bouncing light is going to be very key in interior scenes, and so we're going to be talking a little bit about that as well. And then we also talked about HDRs. And of course, HDRs are still going to be valid for interiors, but not as much, because we only sort of looking through small openings, and those small openings are going to be, not necessarily where we want. Obviously, there's going to be points where we need them as well, but we don't necessarily need this incredible amount of variation and tonality that we get out of interior scenes. We can do that by coloring our lights or coloring our sky a little more specifically. But if you have multiple, large opening with lots of different variants that we want, to collect the bright orange and the blues from different skylights, then of course HDRs are also going to be valid, but not as much in the same way, as you will figure out as we go along through this. Then lastly, what I'm going to talk about what we did talk about was the animation techniques. And this particular technique which we did was about baking light using irradiance mapping. And we talked about how we can bake it through these different maps, and how we collect samples along animation paths or along samples from different points of view. And those things are going to be we're not going to talk about it in this chapter. We're going to talk about different methods. But I want to point out that this is still an extremely valid way of capturing light in interior scenes. And in fact, it's probably the primary way that you're going to want to look at doing animations for static scenes, interiors or exteriors. But we'll be looking at some different techniques just to mix it up a little bit. But just to remember, if we actually look at our scene here, remember that basically we were looking at very low qualities. I don't know actually if it's going to capture well, but remember that basically the noise was traveling through our scenes if we did that, creating the low rendering times, and that basically when we tried to go to the higher settings, we were able to get rid of most of the noise, but at the expense of the rendering time was, double or tripled in terms of doing that. So the other technique that we did was basically to bake it out using the irradiance map, and just a quick refresher, and then our irradiance map was able to get the nice, very low rendering times, and all the noise, all the samples were baked in, so there's no noise traveling at all throughout our scene. Okay, great. So now we've got that basic understanding. Let's go ahead and jump into some more concepts about how this applies to interior scenes.